Well, hello again, everyone. This is Jeff Adler, continuing my video series that follows up my book, Why I'm Right. This is Why I'm Right 2.0. And today I wanted to talk about our culture and how it relates to cultures of the past and to different cultures that America has had. As many of you know, cultures are things that change all the time. Societies go back and forth from, uh, you know, being more liberal or lenient or acceptive of things and other people, and they also are tend to also change into more conservative, more strict, more closed societies. And variations of that back and forth through history. In fact, it could be said that cultures go back and forth, change, sometimes drastically, throughout history. And that there has been probably, I don't know, there's probably been every 2, 3, 4 generations, a culture will flip over. The reasons that cultures tend to flip over vary. Sometimes they flip because war, disaster, natural disaster, economic disaster, revolution, change of government, conquest, all sorts of things. But historically, cultures that exist within long periods of time, like empires, for instance, they still change, even while that empire exists. And in those cases, there's a pattern to when and why cultures change. Seems to me that whenever there is something that is, whenever a certain culture is around for a while, a certain mindset, value system, and there's no real disaster that occurs, a certain stagnation or banality exists with the same thing repeating itself generation after generation. Then there's a generation that just says, "We've had enough. We want to make the world our world the way we want it. We want to improve, modernize. We're tired of the old fuddy-duddy. We're tired of the old-fashioned stuff, and we want to do it the new way." And that's usually done because of that reason. They're bored. They're impatient. Things are just too much the same for too long. However, flip that around. When cultures turn, and that's how cultures turn to more of a liberal type of culture. When cultures turn to a conservative culture from a liberal culture, that is usually the result of war, famine, disease, natural disaster, financial disaster, or whatnot. This is born out of necessity. American or humans tend to run home to mama when it comes to the aftermath of some major bad thing that goes on. That mama is basically when people reevaluate their lives and they start to think about things more seriously, and the little things become, or the big things become important. The little things no longer have any importance to them. They start to think more intently about family, faith, neighborhoods, community, their wives or their husbands, their children, the important things in life, and they shed off the superfluous stuff that makes life complicated and makes life crazy. And we get serious. Over the centuries, periods of time that have been more liberal have seen societies go down paths that are often destructive. They are they lead to the downfall of governments or empires. Sometimes they lead to societies that are openly aggressive or hostile to the rule of law, or to things that people have determined to be important in a civil society. They are more sexually active, perhaps. They are more likely to break the rules or bend the rules or even, break the law itself. They're more apt to push the envelope. They're more apt to change and ignore tradition. And of course, the opposite is true. A conservative society tends to be more willing to uphold the law, to stick with the standards, to hold the traditions. And there's a reason for these societies doing what they do, and there's a reason for them to do it. There's a historical reason for them to do it. and what they do ties in exactly with their mindset. A liberal mindset, a conservative mindset. As I've told you before, a liberal mindset says, ignores the past, doesn't care much for the future. They want to live for the now. A conservative mindset remembers the past, uses it to live in the present, and they plan for the future. And for the most part, this has been the case for maybe thousands of years. You can go back prior to the baby boom generation, which is the generation that broke the mold, that broke all the rules and broke all trends. And we'll get to them in a moment. But prior to them, it was almost, you could almost predict how a given culture would react, or what they would do or accomplish or not accomplish or what have you during their time. As I mentioned, it takes only 2 to 5 generations for the most part historically for a culture to turn over. And I mean maybe even completely all the way over. There are certain things in our world that continue no matter who's in charge of the culture, whether it's left or right, in today's terminology. Certain things that might be on autopilot, certain improvements in technology, certain traditions or taboos or whatever, they just run on autopilot because humanity as a whole holds these as basically untouchable things, or they don't have any control over them. And so there's not a lot of change, whether or not the culture changes. These things seem to go on in perpetuity. But then there are things that are directly affected by the culture. Now, first you have to understand that generations ago, people lived a lot shorter lives. 100 and some years ago, 120 years ago, the end of the 19th century, the average lifespan for most Americans, if you will, was probably 60 to 65 years of age. Maybe not have been quite that, but whatever. If you go back 1,500, 1,800, maybe even 2,000 years ago, the average lifespan was between 40 and 45. Some people live older than that, of course, but that was the average lifespan. So people tended to do things a little faster in their lives and start a little quicker. People got married younger in some cultures. Some people started their jobs or their trade in some cultures a little younger, and had influence in their societies and in their world around them at a younger age than we would consider today, because everything's relative. But they also, because they lived shorter, they wanted to get stuff done, and there was still that idea of legacy. That being said, the today, it took all that time to go from living 45 years to living 65 years. Just a 20-year improvement on the longevity of average lifespan of people. It took almost 2,000 years, for instance. I'm just spitballing here. But in the last 120 years, the average lifespan has reached 80 years of age today. Right there, just right at 80. Brushing up against it. And that's an improvement in 120 years of about 15 years of lifespan. It took 2,000 years to improve it 20 years. It took 100 and some years to improve it 15 more. You see how fast things have changed and how different things are than ever probably before in history. So there are more generations alive at the same time today than in ever before in man's history. You got baby boomers in their 80s who are still, and lots of them, who are still hanging out with millennials and their children. Not sure we've named the new generation yet, but after the millennials, whatever it's called. You got boomers and Gen Xers, Gen Yers, millennials and their children, all living at 5 and 6 generations, because the people who fought the war, some of them are still alive in their 90s and 100s. That's a lot of generations living at the same time. Didn't used to be that way. Now, in America, in the world that we knew from 100 some years ago, throughout most, and probably literally going back 200 years prior to the baby boom generation, for the most part, overall, the world lived in a somewhat conservative umbrella, meaning that times were such that there's certain things you just didn't do, certain ways you didn't act in a civil society, otherwise you were considered either a criminal, insane, something wrong with you up here, whatever. Things just weren't put up with. And society put people who didn't play by their rules away somewhere. And this is how it had been for the longest time. Victorian England, Tsarist Russia, pioneer United States, and during this overall conservative time, we had amazing things happen in terms of inventions and improvements in technology and science and whatnot. The Industrial Revolution, the technological revolution, and on and on. But within that overall society, worldwide, we also have the culture within that society morphing, changing constantly. And I can't speak much about the 19th century, so I won't bother with it, other than to say, as I said, it was probably overall somewhat conservative. Exceptions are everywhere. There are always exceptions. Whether they go on to prove the rule or not is immaterial to this discussion, simply to the point that I think everyone would probably agree that the 19th century was probably more staid than the 20th century. But when the progressive movement infiltrated through the Republican Party and then eventually landed smack dab on the Democrat Party, and they ran with it, things changed. It can be said quite obviously, I think, that the reason they called it the Roaring Twenties wasn't because it was boring, but also it was for other reasons. Despite the fact we had prohibition, despite the fact that during the Roaring Twenties there were no Democrat presidents, there were 3 Republican presidents, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover. Despite what seemed on the outside to be a fairly conservative culture between the 2 progressive presidents, Wilson and Roosevelt, there was a lot of stuff going on in the culture, which proves, and it's still true and it's probably always been true, that the culture can change or do whatever it wants to do completely separate and despite who's in charge. What group's in charge, what political party is in charge, whatever. That the culture isn't up there, it's down where the people are at. So the culture can go completely left or right and it won't matter who's in charge. And that was perfectly indicative of the 1920s, where all the very religious, strict folks were running the show at the top, but the society went completely progressive. They liberalized. They got their rocks off, you might say. They didn't follow the rules. Prohibition was something to argue against, so they opened speakeasies. The youth got involved for the first time in other cultures, and not that that's bad, but at the time, you have to remember these are things that are at the time considered verboten or crazy or just not done. This is just not things we just don't do. Getting crazy with this thing called jazz and going to jazz clubs and dancing in a crazy uncivilized manner, doing instead of the waltz, now we're doing the jitterbug and the Charleston. And we're smoking weed because of the Mexican Revolution brought the marijuana up from Mexico, and the youth thought that would be a good idea to get themselves involved in, as I mentioned in a previous video. And all sorts of other mayhem and madness went on. It was called the Roaring Twenties for a reason. And then disaster struck. A financial disaster that affected pretty much every American, and as such the rest of the world in many ways as well. Maybe not, the jungles of Africa, for instance, but most of the civilized world was affected as well. And we ran home to mama, as I said. People started to get serious again. The big things mattered, the little things didn't. And we stopped screwing around. Now, I ask you, in the 1920s, during the Roaring Twenties, what did America invent? I mean, Marconi came out with the radio in 1921, but he had already invented the thing, or was in the process of inventing the thing, maybe, but it's hard to imagine that was a product of the first year of conservative culture, or second year, or whatever it was. It was a product of something previous to that. But what, okay, we got the radio. We already invented cars. We already invented, telephones and motion picture players, and we already invented the airplane. I mean, what did we invent in the 20s? What major historical and significant thing occurred during the 20s? We had organized crime invented. That's what major thing happened. You might say, well, that's maybe just a coincidence. It had nothing to do with the fact we weren't serious because we were all out playing as children back then. Okay, then I'll back it up in our next part to prove my point. See you then.